Now, this segment here is about railroad cross ties. There's approximately 3,250 cross ties, 3,250 wooden cross ties per mile of track, and that's on class one railroad, the bigger railroads. And they're normally spaced 19 and a half inches apart. Now, on branch lines and spur tracks, the ties are spaced further apart because um, you have less tonnage and or usually have less tonnage and less frequency of trains. So it would make sense to have it a little spaced out further apart. Uh, the primary function of a cross tie is to hold the two paralleling rails together. It ties them together. That's where they the get the word cross tie. Cross tie. It ties up the two opposite rails together to proper gauge. And I mentioned that earlier. The gauge, the standard gauge is 4 feet 8 1/2 inches or 56 1/2 inches. That's in the United States and also other countries. Now, other countries, I think Russia's got 5 foot gauge, a little wider. And like I mentioned earlier, you have more of a surface bearing at that time, that type, but for whatever reason. Um, and the gauge, I just want to clarify, that's measured between the two rail heads, 5/8 of an inch below the top of the railhead altogether. Um, let's see, and historically on all of the American railroads, wood was the primary. That was cross ties, and today, um, let's see, the cross ties today, they chemically treated against insects and decay, and let's see, the dimensions of a cross tie, typical cross tie today, they go in the track structure is 9 by 9 by 7, uh, 9 feet long by 9 feet, 9 inches wide by 7 inches deep. So 9 feet by 9 inch by 7 inch. That's normally how they are, and they normally weigh somewhere around 110 pounds. Um, not too many years ago, creosote was used to preserve, protect, and preserve the wooden cross ties. But I think they got away from creosote. They're using other chemicals now. And I wanted to mention too, years ago, we used to get a gondola rail car, which is an open top car to where you could put material in the car and take material out. Well, we would get a rail car full of creosote soaked cross ties, and boy, I mean, they were just dripping with creosote. But especially in the summertime, that's whenever it releases a lot of that creosote. And men back then they had to get into the gondola car and lift those cross ties out. So it was a back breaking job unless you had a crane to help you unload. But I've seen a lot of times we had to unload it by hand. Um, and creosote, I don't know if I mentioned it, but creosote is a preservative and it tends to burn the skin if you come in contact with it. So that's why most people working outdoors wear long sleeves. And if you're handling cross ties, you gotta have good work gloves. Um, let's see, wooden cross ties, they're made of various hardwoods, but predominantly oak throughout the entire system. And then today, you not only have wooden cross ties, you also have steel, concrete, and what they call composite, which is like plastic stuff. That, but cross ties, wooden cross ties, to me is the best, and I think a lot of people would agree. One other cross tie, wooden cross tie, I want to mention that is named Azobi, O-B-E, Azobe. And the E has a little accent mark to it, so it sounds like an A, Azobe. Um, and it's made of wood. It's a really dense wood, and they're harvested in Africa. Large trees that reach heights of about 200 feet and about 5 feet in diameter. Uh, let's see. Though the wood of the Azobe cross ties is so dense, you cannot drive a spike through it. You know, normal cross tie, you hold your spike this way and you set the spike in it and spike it. But not an Azobe tie. It just does not work. You have to drill the holes, and you have a different type fasteners too. With the railroad that I was with, SB and Union Pacific, they call them pandrel clips. That's just a name of that they name of the manufacturer, but it's pandrel clips. And there's other fasteners that's come into play since that time too. The Azobe ties were they're naturally treated against insects and decay, and so they tend to last a long time, much longer than a typical oak tie. And I've probably heard about the Azobe ties since about the 80s. I've never personally seen one, but I know the railroads do buy them, and and like I mentioned, these ties come from West Africa. Uh, they are too expensive to be installed in the track structure out of face. I mean, talking about like all of them being replaced at one time, and all replaced with Azobe ties. I mean, that it's just too it just costs too much, not cost effective at all. Um, Railroad applications, like I mentioned, it's the railroad would normally use it in wet areas, where areas with poor drainage, or where you would have like a fueling facility. In other words, other places that could use that probably predominantly use Azobe tires, like around the harbors where it's wet all the time, around the houses where you get a lot of diesel fuel and oil, fueling facilities, railroad switches, and turnouts. Um, Now, those take much larger cross ties. In fact, they're not called cross ties, they're called switch ties. And they come in various lengths up to 20 and 30 feet, depending on how big the turnouts are. So anyway, it's and other places that you would put it in would be places that you would ordinarily not want to disturb, or for the least amount, or really would be like in subways or busy road crossings that you can't hardly ever get to, because when you disrupt the road crossing, especially or sub tunnel subways and stuff, it's that's major problems there, you know. Um, let's see, my 44-year experience with the engineering department with both Southern Pacific and Union Pacific has shown me that the above mentioned cross ties, other than wood, work best in areas where you have a firm foundation. That would not work. Concrete ties and composite ties, steel ties would not work in swampy areas. I mean, I've seen that already. They'll break. That's what happens. Wooden cross ties, you can't beat it. It's endured the test of time, and it's more resilient. It's renewable, and it takes the load bearing much better than non-traditional cross ties. The steel ties tend to bend and break, uh, and the same thing with the composite ties. It won't bend or break. It'll break. It won't bend. But cross ties, wooden cross ties, will flex, and that's resilience. You know, Uh, and then when you talk about the life of a cross tie, say a wooden cross tie, uh, greatly depends on the load, the climate, the drainage, and what type of material you're using. So it's really hard to pinpoint exactly how long a cross tie will last. Um, Wood tends to deteriorate greatly in wet climates, poor subgrade, and most importantly, drainage. Um, let's see, years ago, wooden cross ties lasted longer than they do today simply because nowadays we have more traffic and heavier traffic, you know. So I would guess today, but again, it all depends about everything I just mentioned about drainage and everything else. A cross tie today might last 8 to 10 years, somewhere in that, depending. Naturally, a cross tie would last longer if its neighbors are new whenever they're, in other words, like when you go and you replace cross ties out of face all of the time. Sure, they last a lot longer, but what happens when they go defective? Normally, they all go defective at one time. So that's why it's kind of like you change out just the worst ones. Then a few years later, you make another pass and change some more. So, and I've had experience with tie gangs and also rail gangs. Let's see, other non wooden cross ties involved in train derailments. Most of the time, if you have concrete ties or steel ties, composite ties, and they're involved in the derailment, a lot of times that's it. You can't reuse them. You got to pull them out, put some new ones in. Whereas wooden cross ties, yes, sometimes you'll get some that are so bad off to where you have to replace them, but good many a times they are reusable. You can reuse them again. So that's why I think wooden cross ties are the best. Yeah, the wooden cross ties will tend to be scored or marked, and they're usually reusable. Today, rails are securely fastened in place by a minimum of 6 railroad track spikes, usually three track spikes per side. When I started, it was probably four, two on each side of the rail, and then they came out with the hold down spikes, and then you have different patterns. It looks like every time you get a different chief engineer that comes on the property, he wants to put his signature on it, and they kind of changed up the pattern style a little bit, but basically you still have the same amount of track spikes. And rail anchors are something else that holds the rails and cross ties in place. The rail anchors, uh, again, those are depending on the railroad, depending on the chief engineer of that track. A lot of times for whatever reason, they decide to change the type pattern. I would say the best way to go with rail anchors is out of phase. Every cross tie would be boxed in with rail anchors. That would hold them in place and also hold the rails in place. Um, let me see here. Let's see. Yeah, the track spikes will go through metal plates that already have holes punctured through them to where the track spikes go through the tie plates and spiked onto the width of its tie plate is the width of a cross tie too, so it fits on there. Railroads tend to run east and west, like DeQuincy to Baton Rouge. And yeah, I just wanted to mention a little bit about, earlier I spoke about the rail line that came to DeRidder. And after I left the SP side, I was on the Union Pacific. And one of the subdivisions I had was going from the DeRidder to Baton Rouge. And that was the CS, NO, and P Railroad. which is the Colorado Southern, New Orleans, and Pacific Railroad. And that line was proposed to be built in March 1st, 1908. But due to setbacks and stuff, they didn't actually open it up until November of 1908. And at the time, they were going to, I'm talking about the railroad was going to charge the different parishes tax mill, but the way it turned out, the railroad exceeded the limit that they had agreed to. And so that rail line was actually built at no cost to the parish. So the railroad ate it, you know. They thought about taking them to court, but they thought best of it. And what had happened again, it was the Atchafalaya River. Because of high water for a long period of time, they couldn't run the trains and do whatever work they wanted to do. So anyway, it was determined it was an act of God, but it was still, the railroad honored their contract. And so I just wanted to mention that part of it too. So I hope that you've enjoyed this part of my presentation also. I certainly enjoyed talking about railroad. Anytime I got to talk about railroad, I love it. That's my favorite subject. I retired, but I wish I was still working. I missed what I did before, which was riding trains. And I wasn't a locomotive engineer. I was a roadmaster. I started out as a trackman. Worked my way up, and I was a foreman and supervisor. Southern Pacific required the roadmaster to ride his territory twice a month. Now, the Union Pacific said each subdivision once per month, and that it's got to be documented. So I didn't mind that at all. I rode the rails. I got to meet and talk to the train crew members on various subdivisions and became friends with a good many of them. And then I met people in other departments too. So I was friends with people from the roundhouse and car inspectors, trainmen, and even track people. But that was one part of the railroad I always enjoyed, was riding the rails. While I was coming across and talking to train crew members and stuff, I would while you're riding the rails, you're not only talking about the job, but you're also talking about what do you do, where you're from, you get a history, and railroad people, they love to talk too, and they tell you stories about things that happened on the railroad. And what I did, I always loved history all my life, and I would when the tape recorders came into play, I would record a lot of those conversations, and if not, I would make notes, because every time I got on the train or engine, I had to pad, because I had to take notes of rough spots on the track and different things that we were going to come back and take care of. But while I was there, I made notes, and I kept those notes until I retired, and that's when I started writing newspaper articles. Many of them were because of the stories that were told on the railroad. And I've told you that I'm a published author. I didn't tell the camera crew this, but I am a published author. I published 2 books, and I'm working on book number 3. But some of the stories about many of them are railroad-related stories. Anyway, I just wanted to get that little piece in there, and I really appreciate the invite to come here and talk, and really, really appreciate it. And thank you so much.